Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Tapon. I'm here with Dr. Robert Edwards, and we're going to be continuing our conversation of Mallory Irvine and The Last Step but One. His book is down in the description below. You should check out his previous discussions that we had in the description. And this time we're going to be talking about some of the hypotheses of the climate fall, what happened. And we talked about what we know in the previous episode. And this time we're going to go and talk about hypotheses. In other words, things that maybe we don't know, but maybe what might have happened. So, Dr. Edwards, welcome back.
Thank you, Francis. A pleasure as always.
Okay, so here we are at when Mallory and Irvine. This is hypothesis maybe number one. You've got, for those who are following on YouTube, and I encourage you to go to YouTube if you're listening to this audio only, you've got an image here with A, B, C, and G, the pointed gendarme. Talk us through the slide, please.
My hypothesis was concerned with the location from which Odell saw Mallory and Irvine at 12:50 on June the 8th, 1924. And one of the great gaps in our knowledge is that location. We simply do not know. And Odell never made it clear where he was when he made that sighting. And so we are obliged to glean from his descriptions what we can establish, his landscapes, his perspectives, what he could see and what he could not see. I think the critical data are that he said he had passed 26,000 feet. And he said also that he climbed what he called a little crag. He did not make it really clear whether this crag was an isolated rock or some kind of cliff. If he had said so, we would have more to work on. But he did give a number of times which enable us to narrow down where this little crag could have been. And those times are as follows. He left Camp 5 at 8 o'clock. That seems like an accurate time. He said that he saw Mallory and Irvine at 12:50. I assume that's an accurate time. And then later on, and this I think has been greatly overlooked, he said that he arrived at Camp 6 at 2 o'clock. Now, that gives him only 1 hour to travel to climb, in fact, from the sighting location to the Camp 6. And we assume that by Camp 6 he meant Norton's and Somerville's Camp 6. We now know where that place was because Jake Norton and Brent Okita found it again in 2001.
And that's indicated on the slide here. You see N and S in the center of the screen, roughly.
Yes, that little green tent with N and S, that stands for Norton and Somerville.
So A is where the location of where presumably might be the best location of that little crag?
Not necessarily. The A, B, and C were my candidates for the little crag. And I was not entirely sure whether one was better than the other.
Well, I like C. Sorry to interrupt, but C seems like the least likely since it seems to be of lower elevation. Why would he go lower?
Well, he has to be lower because he has to climb to get to G. He said wherever this little crag is, it's below Camp 6 because he sees Mallory and Irvine at 12:50. He continues climbing and he gets to Camp 6 at 2 o'clock. So it's got to be below. For that reason, C is actually more likely than A because A is above G. I was simply, when I put all these things together, I didn't at that time have the KMZ file for Camp 6, but later on I did. I added it to the picture.
On that logic, then A and B are less likely than C, in fact.
Yes, I think A is quite improbable because not only it's above Camp 6, but also you've got to cross that big couloir, which is now known as the Zakharov couloir. And it seems to me quite unlikely that Odell would have crossed that couloir to find the little crag and then not mentioned it. But I think I do need to insert, or if you like, throw you a curveball here. when I was doing this kind of work, I was not entirely sure whether, when Odell referred to um, Mallory's and Irvine's Camp 6, whether he meant Norton's and Somerville's Camp 6, or whether he in fact meant another Camp 6, which, if you can see in the very top left-hand corner of the image, that's where I think Mallory's Camp 6 was. It was not at Norton's and Somerville's Camp 6 at all. And that's another hypothesis which we may have to come back to. But
Got it.
that's the reason that I kept A, B, and C in the running. If Odell thought that Norton's and Somerville's Camp 6 was also Mallory's and Irvine's, then C is in the running and B and A are not. But if in fact he thought or he knew that Mallory's and Irvine's final camp was much higher up, then A and B are both in the running. Like I said, A is a bit unlikely because you got to cross a couloir. B is a possibility.
Right. Okay, so let's move on, because this is now people are scratching their heads. Why are we spending so much time talking about where that damn little crag is? Because it is fundamental and has massive implications when it comes to his famous sighting at 12:50 p.m. on their last day of their lives, because it changes your line of sight, basically. And
that's correct, yeah.
And as you can see in this particular slide, so I'm trying to make an analogy for those who are kind of just listening and not looking at the slides themselves, is that when you are low on the mountain, you can't see certain things higher up on the mountain because the mountain itself is blocking your perspective. The higher up you go, the more things you can see higher up on the mountain. You kind of have, so as a result, if Odell's little crag was higher than relatively high, then it's possible that he could see them at the last step, the third step, as what we call the third step today, that basically they went beyond the fabled second step, which is the hardest step of all. And everybody is debating whether they even went up the second step, or if they try to bypass it somehow. But that's what it comes down to. And so summarize this slide. I tried to a little bit, but is there anything you would want to add there?
No, Francis, what you say is correct. Depending on where you are on the mountain, it determines what you can see. It's not solely a matter of altitude. You can climb up the mountain and then you find, because of the shape of the mountain, that intervening terrain blocks your view of certain parts of the mountain anyway, even though you're high.
Right.
The point that I want to make is that even from his most favorable location, for which purpose I chose Crag A, this would be the point at which she had the best chance of seeing Mallory and Irvine, because from B and C, it's worse. So taking A as his most favorable location, we, of course, today have Google Earth. And we have elevation profiles on Google Earth. So you can put any 2 points on Google Earth, work out what's the terrain between you and whatever it is you're looking at. And very simply, on the point I wanted to make on this slide is that from point A, you can see the third step. You cannot see the second step, and you cannot see the first step. So if there were any doubt from Odell's description that he was describing the third step, I think Google Earth would lay those doubts to rest. It was only the third step that he could have seen.
Excellent. Here's another view of that on this particular slide. Do you want to talk about this?
Okay, well, this is another approach, which is not to do with mathematics or Google Earth or contours at all. It's simply to do with what Mallory said about his plans. And I would say that the point that I want to make is that the overwhelming weight of Mallory's statements about his plans were that he never had any intention of climbing the second step. In all of his writings, in his entire life, not only did he never mention the term second step, he never mentioned even the word step. He never referred to steps on the mountain. He could see the steps, of course, from the base camp. They were visible, all of them, by telescope. Mallory made it very clear, and he wrote, in fact, to one of his correspondents, that the ridge route was out of the question. He said that, I think, as early as 1922, maybe 23. He also wrote that he would not attempt a technically difficult climb that involved, let's say, what he called gymnastic struggles and arm pulls. He had no intention of doing that. He was going for a fast and easy climb.
Right, but hold on one second. Some people have said that he was a ridge climber and that was his thing, that he liked the ridge.
One person alone said that, and that was Edward Norton. Edward Norton said, and it's written here on the slide, Mallory always favored the crest of the northeast arête, which is a word for ridge. There's no evidence that Mallory ever said that. Norton is attributing to Mallory a statement for which there's no evidence that Mallory made it. And when he further goes on to say, and which he followed in his last climb, it's impossible for Norton to make such a statement because Norton could not possibly know. It's therefore an assumption on Norton's part.
Okay, but he has a little bit of evidence. I mean, he knew Mallory for many years. He climbed alongside him. So, but it is a strong statement when he said always favored.
Well, I am not, Francis, I simply have to weigh Mallory's statements, which are very explicit and are written down, against Norton's statement, which is not backed up by any statement of Mallory's.
Right. We have to assume that Mallory's words weigh more than Norton's words on this.
That's the assumption I make. I don't want to get into the motivations of either man.
Right.
Since I never meet them.
Yeah. But we have to go by the assumption that we know ourselves better than somebody else knows ourselves, and we know what we like, and we write down. We got to weigh those words more. Let's move on to the next slide right here, where we got a picture of Andrew Irvine with his suspenders. And then we had a picture of Wang Fuzhou, who was part of the 1960 Chinese team, who claims that he saw a European in suspenders or braces. Anything you want to add there?
Well, I think that this story has been largely erased from the Western narrative about Everest, for reasons that are, for me, a little bit hard to understand. You typically hear commentary on Wang Fuzhou's sighting to the effect that, well, Wang Fuzhou was wrong, Wang Fuzhou mixed up altitudes, or Wang Fuzhou made this up, and anyway, Wang Fuzhou was Chinese. And I detect an extraordinarily, if you like, ethnocentric attitude in this commentary about a climber who had no reason to invent or to confabulate. Wang Fuzhou was a citizen of the People's Republic of China, representing the People's Republic. When he made this commentary, he was speaking to a highly distinguished audience, namely the Geographical Society of the Soviet Union. He was there by invitation. He was speaking on behalf of the government of the People's Republic. I cannot imagine that this was a joke, a misstatement, or an attempt to confuse or to mislead the audience. Unless I have a reason to doubt a person's statement, why would I not accept the statement?
Right. I totally agree with. Go ahead.
There are many examples from Western, if you like, adventure mythology about achievements which have been made, which we do not dispute. For example, we do not dispute that on 14th of October 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. There's no proof of that whatsoever. we have basically Chuck Yeager's word. There's no technical report on the flight itself. There's no instrumentation. There's no database. There's no radar tracking. There's not one single document in the public domain that says Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. Nevertheless, I accept his word.
True.
Why not? He said
By the
he
way,
did.
hold on 1 second. Let's go back down to earth from Chuck Yeager's land about the European embraces. Now, let's.
Yeah.
I agree with you that Wang Fuzhou's 1960 study was not fabricated. It doesn't seem any particular reason, especially with the communist propaganda. You wouldn't want to even admit that a European got that high on the mountain in the first place. So it seems, if anything, he's going to probably lie that he probably denied that he saw him, even though he did. Anyway, so if we go by the assumption that he saw Irvine, because obviously it had to be Irvine, it could not have been Mallory at that altitude, assuming his altitude is roughly right, then that means that Irvine's body was somehow transported down the mountain, either through natural forces or through kinetic forces or some human being hurling him down the mountain. And is that a fair assumption? That he saw Irving, number one, and number two, that's either natural or human forces pushed the body down the mountain, because that's how his foot ended up down in the Rumbuk Glacier?
Well, I think the overwhelming weight of evidence is that that sighting was indeed the body of Irvine. It could not be any other person unless you are willing to entertain an expedition by the Soviet Union in 1952, for which there is very little evidence, and there is essentially only press reports, and that expedition was never acknowledged by any party in the Soviet Union.
Oh,
Did
somebody die in that expedition, 1952?
Well, according to press reports in the British, Swiss, German, and Italian press, and all by entirely reputable journals who had no reason to sensationalize. I'm talking about, for example, the British Manchester Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about La Tribune de Genève. I'm talking about Lo Scarpone in Italia, and I'm talking about Salzburger Zeitung in Germany. All of them reported in 1953 that a Soviet expedition to Mount Everest had failed and that all 6 members of the summit party had died.
Oh, wow. Okay, so therefore, there's a slight possibility that European embraces was a Soviet person. Who knows? But
I think it's
we have to stretch our imagination there.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so let's go ahead.
You had one more question, Francis, which I didn't answer. Mm-hmm. How did Irvine's body, assuming it was seen by Wang Fuzhou, arrive on the glacier? If you look at that Google Earth image, you can see that the probable location of the European embraces or suspenders is very compatible with a trajectory to the head of the northern couloir.
Right.
So I don't think it's necessary at all to invoke human agency here. I think you only have to take, for example, rock falls, snowfall, snowslide, and possibly a slightly lower location on that plateau than where the place mark is, for that body through natural forces to slip over the edge of that cliff and to arrive at the head of the northern couloir. And from there, it's basically it's a toboggan ride to the glacier. Something arriving at the top of the couloir most likely will slide to the bottom, given enough time. You do not need human agency for that.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So we got a lot of slides to cover still. So let's pick up the pace a little bit. Here you got a screenshot from a 1960s film of Chinese, and you got a Chinese somebody who's approaching the third step in 1975, and you've got a boulder field where potentially a European embraces or suspenders could have been seen. Anything you want to add here?
I'd like to add this essentially underlines what I just said to you a moment ago. Firstly, it's very clear from the image in the top left that the Chinese were indeed above the second step. There is no possibility that that photograph could have been taken from anywhere else than above the second step. The formation you see on the left of the image is undoubtedly the third step. There's no other possibility whatsoever. And it agrees with the image which you see in the bottom left, taken in 75. It agrees also with the image which you see in the bottom right, taken in 2005. I think what I would like to add to this is that, and this is work which I've done more recently than this presentation, in fact only in the last couple of months, is that increasingly I'm starting to think that the Chinese in 1960 did not take the modern route. When I say the modern route, you can see in the bottom right-hand image, that route is so traveled that you can see a pathway traveled by hundreds or thousands of climbers that has formed literally a visible path. I'm inclined to think that the Chinese in 1960 were not on there, but were a somewhat downslope of that by possibly some tens of meters, and were probably somewhere in the bottom center to right part of that image. And this makes it, for me, more likely that they traveled either on the ascent or on the descent or both through the boulder field. The boulder field has a name. It's called, some people call it the Olgas. I don't know where that name came from. But I think it's entirely possible, and their own documentary films confirm it, that they're likely to have traveled through that boulder field to get to where they took their panoramas. And if they did, I think it makes it more likely and more easy to understand that Wang Fuzhou saw the European in suspenders somewhere in the boulder field, and this would make it more easy to understand why no modern climber has seen that body. The modern climbers rigorously keep to the modern route. They are not even allowed to leave that route. They do not go through the boulder field.
Right.
And therefore,
we also, but hold on. We also know that, I mean, we're going to get to the next slide here, but modern climbers probably even had no chance to see Irvine's body, because it's quite possible that Irvine's body fell down the mountain 30 years ago or 20 years ago or something like that. In other words, the increase of climbers that have been kind of the hundreds, thousands of steps that have gone through there is a relatively this century phenomenon. But it's possible that in the last century, sometime like in the 1990s or 1980s, maybe, that's when Irvine's body tumbled down the mountain, right?
yes, I think that's also a possibility one cannot discount.
So let's move on to, right. Let's
Yeah.
move on to the Irvine's learning. Right. Here's a slide about Irvine's sock, which clearly has his name written on it. Conveniently for us, it makes it a lot easier. And
Yes.
here we'll have the evidence for your hypothesis here. Go ahead to briefly summarize this slide.
Okay, well, this kind of underlines what I said to you earlier. I had
In the previous,
essentially, yes, in the podcast, which part one of our podcast, I had, as I said, two mechanisms whereby I could try to geolocate the image in the National Geographic. One was the width of the moraine, which gave me a relatively narrower field of where that image could have been taken, but more rigorously, and that's the point of this image here, is that Peak Finder or Peak Visor allow you to pick a point and look around and see what you see. And I thought it was quite consistent. The image in the sunglasses was quite consistent with the saddle or the ridge. It's actually two intersecting ridge lines. It's not a saddle. Between two mountains to the east of the glacier, and one of them is Changtse, or North Peak, and the other is Jianbingfeng. And to my mind, those two intersecting ridge lines, as seen on Peak Visor, are quite a reasonable candidate for the shape that I see in the reflected image. I'm not, if you like, completely satisfied with this correspondence, but I felt it was a reasonable backup to what I had measured from the moraine.
Right. And
Hence my reason for saying 6.5 kilometers was
Right.
a reasonable working assumption. In other words, it's like prove me wrong.
right.
National Geographic prove me wrong. I've written to National Geographic and they have not replied.
Right. Unsurprisingly. Okay, that's hypothesis 5.1. Hypothesis 5.2. Describe it briefly.
Well, okay. Here, my interest was to try and geolocate Irvine's boot and his remains laterally, as to say from west to east on the glacier, as opposed to from north to south. I felt relatively confident in north to south with my idea of 6.5 kilometers, but east to west is quite an important um, consideration, because if he had been more to the west um, of the glacier, then it would be more likely that he had fallen down the northern couloir from a point where he had been seen by Wang Fuzhou. But if he was more to the east, as to say towards the eastern lateral moraine, then it would be more likely that he fell at the same time as Mallory. Because Mallory, if you extend his fall line, you will arrive at the more to the eastern part of the glacier than the western part. So the lateral displacement of Irvine's boot and remains from the central flow line was quite critical. But I have to say that I'm kind of agnostic here. I don't have enough data. It's as simple as that. The data that I have, the imagery that I have, the calculations I've made, do not enable me to exclude either of these scenarios. I can neither exclude a scenario of a fall down the northern couloir from the suspenders point, nor can I exclude a fall from the extended fall line of Mallory.
Right.
So I cannot right now say that Mallory fell with Irvine or Irvine fell alone. Well, sorry, I may need to qualify that. If indeed it was Wang Fuzhou saw Irvine, then Irvine fell alone. He could not have fallen with Mallory.
Right. And by the way, those who are looking at these images, it's glaciers are slow-moving rivers, and so if those people are wondering, like, how the hell did Mallory's boot ended up so far away from the base of the mountain? Well, it's because the glacier is a very, very slow-moving river, taking ice and churning bodies and ripping bodies apart on their journey.
Yeah, let me correct you, Francis. Irvine's boot was found.
Did I say Mallory's?
You said Mallory's. It was Irvine's boot that was found.
Yes. Yes.
And you're completely correct. The glacier is a very slow-moving body. It can move as little as a few meters per year, or it can suddenly have a slip and move hundreds of meters in a year. Which takes us to this next slide.
5.3 hypothesis. Briefly, this is a complex slide for a lot of people to kind of digest. You've got on the graph, you have the years from 1924 all the way to the present day. And what is and the amount of meters per year that the glacier is moving, the ice velocity, and it seems like a declining rate.
Yes.
So, anything else you want to add that is a key takeaway for those who are trying to digest this slide?
Well, yes. First of all, the declining rate is something that we should expect. It may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but with global warming, glaciers have started to melt on a large scale throughout the world, including, of course, the central Rongbuk Glacier. And maybe intuitively you would think, well, if a glacier melts, it should move more quickly. In fact, it's the reverse. The speed of a glacier is dictated by the mass of the glacier. The heavier the glacier, the more it presses on the underlying rock, and the more the ice at the bottom melts. And that's what makes the glacier move. When a glacier is exposed to a higher temperature, it loses mass on the top. That doesn't make the glacier move. It makes the glacier lighter and therefore more stable.
Right.
So that's one, I think, important point that viewers should understand. I think the second important point, if we can just stay on that slide briefly, is that although the slide shows 1924 to 2024, only the solid line at the right of the slide is based on hard data from satellites. Everything else is basically mathematically modeled, and it gets more and more uncertain as you go back in time. So I do not want to make a hard statement about what the graph tells us. The satellite data are relatively good data, but they are also very, very dispersed. The velocities change enormously from one point on the glacier to another. They also change a lot from one season to another, and they change a lot from year to year. So we cannot really take an average of the data and say, well, the glacier moved at this rate and therefore he arrived in 100 years or he arrived in 30. We're not able to make that statement. And that's what I've said in this hypothesis. I cannot exclude a fall in 1924. I cannot even exclude a fall after 1960. All of those are consistent with the data. And unless National Geographic will come back to me and tell me more precisely where they found the boot, that's the limit of what I can do with the data. I don't want to squeeze more inference out of the data than the data allow.
Right. And so there's a huge margin of error in the data. And as a result, it's hard to know exactly when the body fell. It could have fallen 100 years ago. It could have fallen 64 years ago. We simply don't know, or even more recent. It is a bit frustrating. So last slide here, as we wrap up the conversation in the last 2 minutes. Here are some of your reflections. Tell us what you think on your hypotheses.
Well, okay, I included this slide at the end of my presentation in Mendoza, or to Mendoza, because it doesn't constitute a hypothesis. It's more of the nature of what I think is reasonable to conjecture. And the point that I wanted to make very simply is this. When Mallory and Irvine were seen by Odell on 1250 on June the 8th, 1924, there was no obstacle between them and the summit. There was nothing that could prevent them. And I think that all the argumentation to the effect that they failed, the onus is on those arguments to back it up. For example, if we are modern climbers, I'm not a climber, but a modern climber, you or I, or anybody at reasonable fitness, having arrived at the top of the second step, will reach the summit. There's nothing to prevent it, barring a disaster.
Or bad weather.
An extraordinarily bad weather, yes. A medical event, an accident. Once you're above the second step, you will reach the summit. Why would we argue that Mallory and Irvine could have failed without any data? There was nothing to prevent them from reaching the summit. I have argued in many of my presentations that they could reasonably climb 300 vertical feet per hour. They had done that, not Irvine, but Mallory had done it in 1922 without oxygen. Finch and Bruce had done it in 1922 with oxygen. It didn't seem in 1922 like oxygen was a major factor in it. Well, when they were seen by Odell, they had approximately 600 vertical feet to climb. That's 2 hours, let's say 3, to allow for the altitude. Had they reached the summit, the descent would have been at least twice the speed. That was well established in climbs in 22 and 24. Therefore, if they had taken as much as 3 hours to reach the summit, in other words, 1550, they reached the summit, they can be back in 1.5 hours, well before the sunset. So in short, there was no technical obstacle to reaching the summit. And I think the onus is on those who say no to give us reasons why.
On that hopeful note, I'll remind everybody to go to the description below to get Dr. Edwards' book. Dr. Edwards, thank you so much for your conversation. I look forward to talking about your future book coming out in 2027 about the whole Irving story more in depth. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Francis, again. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.